Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the president of AAPC and Emmons and Company, Dale Emmons.
Good afternoon. Here's the Hardy Bunch in this that's shown up here. Maybe some more of them will drift in from the bar upstairs. That's kind of a hard competition. I have a few housekeeping matters I'd like to bring to your attention first. The AAPC's online silent auction is going on right now. If you have your iPad or your laptop with you, you can go online and bid early and often. And because all the proceeds are going to our scholarship fund at the foundation, there's some exciting things on the online auction, some fabulous vacation places that are going to be offered to the high bidder. And even Jamie Sexton gave us some wine. So something for everybody. Political memorabilia. We hope you'll go on and place bids. It's a real honor for me to invite to the podium to make an announcement about another upcoming AAPC event. Our Midwest chapter president, Jamie Sexton. Jamie, would you come up and tell them what's coming up?
Hi, I'm Jamie Sexton. Like Dale said, I'm the president of the Midwest chapter. 2 years ago, we did an event in Chicago, and it was kind of like reinvigorated the Midwest chapter, and we got a whole lot of new members. We're going to do it again here May 20th. So any of you guys who live in the Midwest, or any of you consultants who do stuff in Chicago or in the Midwest, you ought to attend. We're going to have some really exciting platforms. We're going to have a couple of really cool keynote speakers, and of course there'll be the obligatory, high energy reception and dinners, and we'll have a lot of fun. So we'll be sending out an email announcement here in the next week or so with all the rest of the details, but it's May 20th from 9 to 5. We'll have hotel arrangements on the email and everything, so hope to see you there.
Stay right here. Hey, Jamie, just to get our pump primed, I got a little something for you to take home with you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, buddy.
Thanks, Dale. Have a good one.
Is Liz Chatterton in the room? She's not here, is she? She's at the bar. Okay, well, I was going to have her give us a little sales pitch on tonight's women's networking event, but it's on your schedule, women only. And if you have an interest in showing up, I'm sure they'll be glad to share their libations with you. It's an exciting event that we've added to the schedule, and it has 21 women business owners and partners that are sponsoring the event, and we're excited about having that. Excuse me? The rest of us, we have Dutch treat at the lobby lounge. It's a real honor for me to bring to you the Senior Vice President of Collective, Justin Evans, to present an industry perspective on data and a multi-screen voter. Is he backstage? Oh, here he is.
I like the rock and roll intro. Can you hear me okay? I'm Justin Evans. I head up product strategy at Collective. And first, of course, we'd like to thank the AAPC for this great event and for recognizing the importance of data and science in modern political campaigns. I'm also honored to share a stage, if not at the same time, with Sasha Eisenberg, whose book, The Victory Lab, is a leading work on the use of science in campaigns. What I'd like to do is just, for a couple minutes, talk about what Collective has seen in the world of targeting audiences across screens in the political space as a way of teeing up the panel topic. Collective is a digital media company founded in 2005, and what we do is we make digital, data-focused ad campaigns our core competence. That's what we do. And Collective's primary business, is to put that data to work for brands from American Express to Zipcar. And what we do is we help them identify customers in the digital arena using data. Moms and dads who make over $100,000 and own an Audi, kids who visit tech websites and are always in line to get the latest smartphone. And starting a few years ago, we saw increasing demand for our services in the political sphere thanks to the strong relationships we have in Washington. And the chief observation we had about the use of data in the 2012 election was the quantity and richness of data that our political clients brought us. Tens of millions of records of voter data classifying audiences as strong and weak Republicans, as issue voters, and any number of custom classifications our clients built out using their own analytics tools that they ported into our system and then used to target digital advertising across computers, smartphones, and tablets. So the first point was the richness of the data. The second is that Collective's political clients were also keen on the granularity of the geographic targeting they could perform in digital. They gave us inputs in the form of some very strange lists of gerrymandered zip codes to fulfill the needs of congressional campaigns, as well as using our system at full blast for the national campaigns, hitting the 230 million persistent profiles we maintain in our system. But the final observation, and perhaps the most exciting development for us in 2012, was that the political campaigns were just as keen as our commercial clients to see a true multi-screen approach to targeting. TV was and will continue to be the keystone of almost any kind of communications effort. But what we were finding is we're hearing clients say, well, what happens when TV is not enough? What do I do about the younger audiences who might not be spending as much time in front of the TV as their older counterparts? Or what about the wealthy, tech-savvy audiences who just don't watch that much TV? Or what about people who just aren't watching the shows my ads happen to be on? So Collective pioneered the use of television set-top box data to help advertisers coordinate their digital campaigns with their TV campaigns. We helped advertisers identify who was going to see their TV campaigns based on the programs that they had bought and the schedules. And maybe more importantly, we helped them identify who was going to miss their TV ads. And then we helped our clients find those audiences on digital devices to truly create a 360-degree approach to their communication strategy. So 2012 was an exciting political year for data. It was an exciting year for Collective. And this year in 2014 are surely going to push us into new areas of innovation. And Collective is very excited to be part of what is clearly a continuously evolving story. So on behalf of Collective, thanks again to the AAPC, and thanks to all of you. Cheers.
Thanks for having us. So we're going to talk about data and analytics in campaigns. I've written a bit about this, and I think one of the problems that we often have when we start conversations about this is that people pretend that data just got introduced to politics. And basically, as some of you may know, there's been data in politics for a long time, and certainly since the beginning of punch card computing, people have tried to organize voter files and find the most intelligent ways to sort through them, have tried to organize precinct data, to do geographic targeting. Starting in the 1970s, at the beginning of direct mail, people were doing A/B testing. So the idea of using data for problem solving isn't something that just happened in 2012 or 2004. But I do think there have been two major innovations that have taken place that I've written about that have dramatically changed the capacity of what's possible to measure and understand in campaigns. The first, though, is all of the individual level data that's become available to campaigns and that we've been able to link up with voter registration records most of it from consumer world, and the ability to perform statistical modeling with that data to come up with predictions of individual level attitudes and behavior. And the other big breakthrough comes sort of not from the corporate world, but from the academic social sciences and the use of randomized experiments, not just to measure the effectiveness of different fundraising appeals, but starting with mobilization and registration, and now increasingly with persuasion to empirically measure the ability of political communication to move people in the real world and not be solely constrained by the sort of hypotheses that come out of polls or focus groups about how people will act if you give them a certain piece of information. And one of the most exciting things, I think, has become the possibility of merging all of that individual level statistical modeling, what we often call micro-targeting, with experimental design, and the new confidence it gives people in and around campaigns to measure effectiveness. And I'm very lucky to have here two people whose work among those whose work I've most enjoyed writing about, who had sort of lead analytics jobs on the presidential campaigns last year to talk through sort of where we are, what is possible and what isn't. I think one of the other problems we have about these conversations about data is they end up either being too ridiculously broad, or they focus on obsessively on one particular detail or specific example at the expense of the broader thing. So I'm hoping we can sort of try in a little methodical way to go through understanding what can we do with analytics, what can't we do, and what looking ahead to the next election cycle, where are areas where our ability to measure things will grow. So joined on my left by Alex Lundry, who's a vice president and research director of Target Point Consulting, which is basically the lead micro-targeting firm on the right. Alex has been there since 2005. The firm is slightly older than that. In some incarnations, it's worked with Mitt Romney since his first gubernatorial campaign in 2002. And this past year, Alex was last spring, detailed to Boston and served as the director of data sciences on the Romney for President campaign. And he's now back at Target Point. Dan Wagner started as a volunteer on the Obama campaign in 2007. Got sent out to Iowa as your voter file manager. Is that?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Bounced around a variety of states during the primaries, ran a regional targeting desk for the general election in 2008, afterwards moved to the DNC as its targeting director, and then in the first part of 2011 moved out to Chicago and became the director of analytics for Obama for America, and tells me he is trying to figure out what he's doing with his life now. And I guess we're up to 6 months of aimlessness.
It's been wonderful.
So I wanted to start by asking each of you, looking back at this last election cycle, what were the areas that we made the biggest gains in terms of using data analytics? What are types of questions that we are now able to answer that we might not have been before? And sort of attached to that, what are the areas that still remain, were sort of mysteries or unsolved questions?
Yep.
I think the winner gets to go first.
Is that how it goes? I mean, the big, from my point of view, like, the big innovation for us, I guess it's just a short blurb, but after the campaign, I gave this little talk at an organizing conference. And this woman, Candace, she was a volunteer in Cincinnati, and she comes up to me and she goes, hey, we had just given the big presentation on the persuasion experiment and what we found and all that. And basically what that was is we took thousands of volunteers and we had them randomly call 300,000 voters and not call another set of 150,000 voters. And we did these post IDs to basically identify whether or not our persuasion message as delivered by volunteers was working, and more importantly, with what types of voters it was working more or less. And the difficulty of this was, the design was complicated, but the execution required a lot of secrecy from people like Sasha. And it required a massive amount of training of basically teaching these thousands of volunteers of how to essentially execute this experiment. She comes up to me and she says, I thought it was great, everything that you did, but I have 5 pieces of criticism. And she basically just lays into me, right? She goes, your scripts were clunky. They sounded like they were written by a bunch of nerds and not a bunch of volunteers. And I was like, that true? She said that was, this and that. And all of her criticism were very good. And it signified a few things. But the most important thing that it signified is that this woman, Candace, in Cincinnati, Ohio, basically had internalized the entire process of an analytics infrastructure and her role into it, and basically had figured out her part in the process of helping to build the experiment and helping to build the targeting, and basically her process in kind of training volunteers on what to do about it and refine it. And when we look back, we have mounds and mounds of technical innovation. We have, individualized persuasion experiments. We have fundraising testing. We have optimized media that saved us $100 million and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, the thing that we think biggest about is basically this downstream innovation of basically building an entire infrastructure with tens of thousands of, essentially full-time employees that participated in the story of data. And the results were, they were impressive.
So from your perspective, what are the biggest gains that we've made over the last cycle?
Yeah, I think that if you look at the tools and the processes and even most of the data that were used in this cycle, much of it is just innovation. It's incremental innovation. Yeah. And it's innovation through integration, right? Innovation through a better culture. But I would say the one area that is or was completely new this year that we did not have in 2008 was online sentiment analysis. And so we actually used a tool called National Dialogue Monitor, where we were, it's basically text mining. You're crawling the internet every single day, and you're sucking up any bit of English language digital text. And so that could be Twitter. Most often when you hear talk of sentiment analysis, it's mostly talk of Twitter. It could be other social networks and blogs and the like. But if you're using the right tool, you're also getting newspaper articles, you're getting radio transcripts, you're getting closed caption television information. And what these text mining programs are able to do is they're actually able to automatically detect when you're talking about a specific entity, a person, place, or a thing, and they're able to code that for tonality. Is it positive or negative? And so you could, on any given day, you could look back and say, what was the discussion on Mitt Romney? What was the discussion on President Obama? What was the volume for each candidate? And what was the tone of that? And so that was really a brand new data set in this cycle that we found just extraordinarily helpful and extraordinarily interesting. Because the idea being here is that opinions don't change without new information, right? That's the only way that somebody's mind is changed about who they're going to vote for or what issue they care about. Pollsters measure the output, the declared opinion, right? But if you can actually measure the input, that is, have some sense of the sum total of information that is available to be consumed by voters, then perhaps that you can have some sense of what's going to happen on the output. You can perhaps be slightly ahead of the curve. And this actually became a very important tool for the campaign. We would look at volume and sentiment measures for Governor Romney and President Obama specific to certain issues. We would match that up with the GRPs, gross ratings points that we were putting behind a certain ad. And then we were also matching it up with our polling as well. And we were able to basically disentangle what is the order of effects in terms of when you introduce a message, what happens with that message. And we came away really learning some really fascinating stuff about how messages are formed, what people pay attention to, in that, basically a television commercial, what it's good for is starting a conversation, right? You basically hold up a shiny object and you say, look over here, this is very important. We should be talking about this. And it essentially jolts a conversation into being that may not have even been there. And so you look at something like the president's ruling on welfare rules that we hit on fairly hard during the campaign. He made that ruling. I can't remember exactly what the timeline was between when that ruling was made and when we went up with a commercial on it, but it was a matter of weeks. There was no discussion, really, no change in discussion of President Obama and welfare during that time period when we weren't hitting on it. There really wasn't much coverage at all. I remember when we went to cut the commercial, we wanted to find a headline to use, and there were no headlines to use on it. But the second we cut a commercial and we put it out there, it jolted this conversation into life. And what we found is people talked about it on Twitter first and foremost. Within about 2 days, the volume on Obama and welfare rocketed negatively. And then about 2 days after that, we saw in the news media, radio, print, television, discussion of Obama and welfare about 4 days later skyrocketed. And then ultimately that trickled down to our ballot among independents specifically. And so we were able to measure this effect over and over and over again. And to us, that was really one of the most useful and new tools that we had at our disposal. And I think the quality of that sort of tool is only going to improve.
So I want to go through a few of the sort of core functions of a campaign and have each of you give a sense of where we stand now, what is measurable, what questions are we able to answer with data and analytics, and what's still out there that is sort of beyond the grasp of what's doable now. So let's start with what probably the volunteer in Cincinnati was doing every day: field, voter contact, targeting. Where do we stand?
Yeah, I mean, campaigns, we do 5 things, right? We register people to vote, we persuade people, we turn people out, and then we build an organization and we fund that organization to help do those initial 3 things better, right? And in each, there's essentially no bound in kind of our ability to do each of those things better. I mean, the efficiencies will kind of like reach some asymptotic point over time, and we've definitely kind of gone a long way in reaching those. But on the side of the Democratic Party, I think our history leans more towards being very good at registration historically, particularly with some of the messaging that's come out of the Analyst Institute, some other organizations, towards getting very good at get out the vote. And in this cycle, for the first time, which is how we think about persuasion in a more organized way. And most of our lessons from persuasion, they come equally from 2010, but they come from our past. And the hardest thing that I think we as an organization had to deal with was this fundamental assumption that when you do work, something good happens. And the truth is that there is no statistical guarantee that you as a person that spends money, who talks to voters, sends a piece of mail, has a volunteer do something, that will guarantee an increase in votes. And if you look at kind of the aggregate set of studies and what the big kind of crisis of conscience we had in 2010 is when we actually said, we're spending tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars, this is actually doing anything. The result was not good. It was terrible, right? And that led us to a long period of evaluation that said, from a persuasion point of view, that A, this is much harder than we think. The language that we're using to describe ourselves is misleading and stupid.
What do you mean by that?
The language that we would use is we say, we need to touch this person, right? We need to hit this person. We need to do something to this person, right? Those don't mean anything, right? What means something is whether or not you can statistically verify or validate that if you talk to somebody that it will have an effect on average, right? And the moments in the campaign were when we would test these out, and what the thing with Candace of why that was so important is we looked at her experience with tens of thousands of other volunteers and looked at the average treatment of her conversation relative to other types of conversations with different messages, and saw basically this kind of narrow set of people that were actually being influenced, right? And we do that okay now. Right? We do that okay. And I think we've done a good job as an organization in kind of getting away from this kind of painful history of thinking that just because we do something, that something will come out on the other end, towards a approach of experimentation and validation to actually justify our own existence. But I think as we go on, we're going to be able to partition better towards, we know that talking to kids is extremely difficult, right? Because of receptivity and because of availability and because of channel confusion. We know it's very difficult, right? And as we get better, we're going to hopefully become a better organization that not only validates on average effects across entire populations, but hopefully that kind of builds an architecture of testing where we can say, we're talking to this group with this group with that, this group with this, so that we are more personally relevant to people within the specific channels that they care about. And we've done a good job in the past cycle of at least, getting a little bit there to get over our hump. But at the same time, we have just kind of incredible movement that we require as an organization to move forward to be more specific and more relevant to voters.
Alex, I mean, so both you talking about sort of broad media dissemination and in this case, isolating specific effects, but it's sort of, to what extent should people who are involved in campaigns take these lessons as translatable to 2014 or to local races? I mean, should we think of what you're describing as like a law of physics in terms of how information moves that does translate? Should we think that how much can we learn from specific persuasion experiments conducted in the context of 2012?
Yeah.
And
yeah, it's a great question, and I'm hesitant to say that you can apply any of these lessons to other races because, especially in the context of a presidential campaign, it's so remarkably unique that this idea that the TV commercial to Twitter to news media to ballot that I described earlier, I think it'd be pretty foolish to expect that to translate down to a congressional race. Maybe some form of that, maybe it looks somewhat like that, but they are fundamentally different information environments in which you're campaigning. And so I do think it's a matter of building upon, taking what's been found in these experiments, trying to redoing experiments within the context of your own campaign, and understanding how it may be appropriate to your specific circumstances. I mean, we are at a point now where we're building a very robust and meaningful bank of knowledge about political behavior, political communication, and persuasion and the like, but you can't necessarily lift these wholesale from one campaign to another.
so you want to, Dan, sort of in the online digital realm, Alex talked a little bit about sentiment analysis. What are we good at understanding? What are we still not there on? And where do you see opportunity for sort of improvement in learning in the digital online internet space?
The thing that we're not, we're not very good at digital right now. We're frankly pretty terrible at it.
And that means terrible at actually measuring
real
world
everything.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, if our standard is we can send out a piece of mail or have a conversation and understand ahead of time the effects of those conversations, then measure those conversations, see at a time what the effects of those conversations is, and see whether or not there's actually an effect on the electoral outcome. We can do that okay, right?
This is measuring registration or turnout or
we can do that all okay. But in the digital world, I think we made, our first attempt this year was targeted sharing, which was this attempt where we say we have persuadable voters, motivation targets, registration targets, et cetera. We match that up to the social graph, and we link up people through their friendships to say these are the people based on the value of your personal relationship to that person and the value to us of a campaign. We can prioritize them and say that's going to you, right? And I think that's kind of the first time we've had kind of non-generic targeting of people based on their actual value to the campaign, we think. But even there, we still don't have like a good idea. Like the matching is still really hard, and people cover that up. It's terrible. This is
matching through cookies and through social media?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. To say like this is a person in the digital world. This is because the objective is you classify people on the voter file, right? Which is your canonical database of everything. You have those people as consumers of information over here with bits of information, and you want to get the highest degree of match between those two databases, right? It's very difficult. It's extremely difficult. And
do you have a rough sense of percentage of a voter universe that you can confidently match online?
Well, it depends on your database. I think we are. we are privileged with our database because of how big it is and how large it is, and it's probably, you know, the Democratic Party's kind of database is like its prized possession, you know? So that is probably not really rivaled by any other organization in the country. And, you know, our ability to match is probably pretty good, you know, half, probably, I don't really know. But again, you know, it's not like in field where we think, you know, we have to develop a process where we can actually communicate to those people, run IDs or something afterward to see whether or not there's actually been a reasonable effect. And there's kind of a time lag that, you know, frankly, we just haven't figured out yet.
Well, and the match is only step one of the
Yeah,
issue, and
right.
knowing those effects, because I mean, because of I think very valid privacy concerns.
Yep.
Once you do that match, all you know is that you have matched a certain number of people on your voter file, and that they may have been delivered an ad. But from there, you only get aggregated numbers, right? So I may know that 100,000 people in my persuasion universe were delivered an online display ad. I don't know precisely who those 100,000 people are.
Right.
I don't know precisely who clicked through that ad.
And if those are calls or door knocks or mail, you'd know.
Then we'd know
who you reached.
We
right?
know exactly who we reached. And so, you know, there is still this very meaningful brick wall between the online and offline world. And one of the other big innovations is this cookie matching, the ability to target an individual online. But that we can target them, but we can't quantify the effect that we had on that person.
Right.
I don't know that we ever will be. It depends on kind of what happens with conventional practice and also legislatively with the privacy laws. So, I mean, matching and then understanding its effects, it's still very difficult. So I completely agree with Dan. We just, in terms of modeling behavior, understanding, you know, the effects of what we do, digital is still really a bit of a wasteland, which is amazing considering the volume and velocity of data that digital produces, and the fact that, frankly, what a lot of people talk about in terms of analytics is mostly focused on things like website optimization, A/B testing, and so a lot of the discussion of analytics focuses on that digital end. But when you're talking about analytics from kind of a voter prediction perspective,
Yep.
and a proof of performance perspective, we're still really struggling with digital.
So media buying, what are we good at? What did we get better at? And where is there still room for growth or improvement?
Oh yeah, I mean, you know, this is one. The whole industry is kind of turning on its head,
Yeah.
right? And if you're in front of it, you're going to survive. If you're behind it, you're going to go bankrupt, right?
Yeah.
And it's what is so interesting about media is, you know, it's becoming more and more and more like field, where we have this individual canonical database of people and targets over here. We have a bunch of households sitting in their TVs over here. And before, we could optimize on a set of 500,000 of those people, right? To say, like, this market of 500,000 people has 5% more persuadable voters than this market of 500,000 people over here. And then it became cable zones, and we can target this 50,000 people has 10% more persuadable voters than this 50,000 here, right? And then it became subsystems, and then it became households, right? And where we landed in the campaign was taking our list of, again, our individual segments from the voter file, persuadable, registration, turnout targets, matching those anonymously to households that were, you know, viewing these things and saying, all right, what's a new persuadable rating, right? How are we, again, optimizing on persuadable points per voter for these different television programs such that in each media market or subsystem, we can then rank order our spending in terms of the thing we actually care about, which is number of persuadable voters per dollar, right? Which is a pretty big contribution. And where that's going, though, and that's, you know, one step in the process, but where that's going is, you know, household level addressability. Mm-hmm. It's going there, you know? Yeah. And
that'll be dependent on the cable systems to make it available, right? That's not an analytical challenge at the moment, right? That's
no, but it's going to present analytical challenges when we get there,
Yes.
right? A lot. Yeah, it's going to be hard. It'll be fun, but it'll be hard.
Yeah, I mean, I can agree with what Dan said more.
Yeah.
While sentiment analysis was new, we've always been trying to optimize media buys, but this innovation, The idea that we can actually now target our media buys to our persuasion universe, to our turnout universe, that is what is going to revolutionize the industry. I mean, TV is your biggest line item in the budget. It is the least accountable. It is the least data-driven. And that is going to completely change. And I couldn't be happier, right? Because it's amazing now. You have a group of, we want to hit these 100,000 people. As of right now, you can get back a ratings book for those 100,000 people and see what shows they over-index on. And you could approximate this through things like Scarborough data before, right? Scarborough asked party ID, they ask some sort of voter turnout question. And you could get some interesting data on this, but here you're actually getting the ratings book for the names, for the actual people that you are trying to persuade. And that just completely changes the game. And ultimately, where all this is going, like Dan said, is set-top box addressable advertising. And that is just gonna be a game changer. There's only one place in the country right now that you can do that, and it's a cable system in New York City. And even then, it's not really perfect, because if the three of us were watching TV, and let's say I was McDonald's and I wanted to deliver a customized ad, I could deliver ad A to Dan, ad B to Sasha, ad C to myself. But we're still not at a point where Dan would be the only one who would see a McDonald's commercial, and everybody else would see a laundry detergent commercial. But that's where it's going. And Dan's right. You gotta get on board with this, because the industry is just completely going to change in the next 10 years.
It seems like the big challenge, both in terms of talking about cookie matching and media buying, is that the way that data has been organized for consumer marketing, I mean, the challenge is to figure out ways to constructively match up, what you described as the canonical list of the voter file with a consumer data that's not organized for political uses, right? And
yeah.
It's a
Yeah,
mess,
match rates are what's enabled this whole revolution. I mean, you look at my boss, Alex Gage, really the founder of micro-targeting in the political space. He tried to match up voter files to consumer files in the 90s, and the match rates were abysmal. And it was only in 2000, 2001, 2002 where the match rates got up above 90%, and now we're at just, essentially 99% match rates when you're going voter to consumer. And that's what enables it. And so, yeah, you're right. Once these systems get put in place that you can match more easily into media data and the cookie data, then that's what's going to allow this to really take off.
so the big strategic questions of the campaign faces budgeting, allocation of resources, including candidate time. How can analytics be useful there, and what is still sort of out there to be measured and learned?
Yeah, there are a bunch of kind of strategic components to the Obama campaign. One was kind of the more obvious part about how we kind of, run the election as, a choice rather than a referendum. And that was, a big part of the strategy when we start early or late, how we define our opponent. But a big choice that we had to make as a campaign very early on with not too much information, which is in what states do we play and how do we play in those states? So what is the map? And then more importantly is what was kind of your average path to victory within states, and then kind of aggregated across states. And for us is our kind of work began in summer 2011 to really define the estimated required contributions by registration, turnout, and persuasion in each state ahead of time to say, if we're at 47, we need to get to 51.
These are vote goals.
Yeah, these are vote goals. Yeah, they're vote goals. But it's important to, is typically how that's done is ahead of time they do a voter file analysis and they say, all right, this many Democrats, this many Independents, this many Republicans, whatever, right? And how that's changing is on our side is we can actually define those in terms of investment and ROI, right? This much work equals this many votes to this many people, and this is the people who they actually are, right?
And so walk me through that. What is that? What number are you actually looking at there? It's a cost per.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Marginal additionalized.
Right. So if think a campaign has $1 billion, right? You need to take those $1 billion and move them all the way down the chain. So you have some distribution by state, right? You have some distribution within state by voters, right? And at every level, what you're trying to optimize are votes per dollar at each level. And that will get you down to some kind of like, some efficiency criteria to say like, we can go to this level and no lower, right? And for, one of the big decisions that we made in the campaign, which was a very scary decision from our point of view, but justified by the empirical data, was to what extent we can actually persuade people to be with us, right? Because if we couldn't make that justification, it would basically provide us with a completely different map. If we thought we can only win this election by expanding the electorate, right, which is we have to register, 2 million people, we can turn out X many people, and we kind of know how well we can do that. Option 3 is how many minds can we actually change? Our experience of 2010 was with failure, with we can't, we're terrible at this, right? And walking into 2012 with general skepticism, internally, externally, about how capable we were as an incumbent in a high information election to actually and effectively and efficiently change people's minds. And the results of that work basically helped us redefine our investments by voter, but also by state, in terms of there were, large, previously unknown sets of persuadable voters that could push us beyond 51%. You look at Florida, for example, where people say, why would you invest in Florida? Well, the reason we invest in Florida is because we think we can earn about 350,000 votes through turnout and registration, which is not enough to win. But we think that we can get an additional 150 to 200,000 votes, not through like willy-nilly voter file analysis, but through very like practical, empirical testing of
And that was
changing
from
minds.
the experiments, from persuasion
exactly.
experiments?
Yeah.
In terms of resource allocation, candidate time, where's analytics helpful in the big sort of strategic planning questions?
Well, yeah, first, to Dan's point about vote goals, I do think that analytics can be very helpful with vote goals. What has previously been a very kind of loosey-goosey, touchy-feely process of determining what your vote goals are, you can use the micro-targeting propensity codes to basically run simulations on the electorate, right? So if I know that somebody has a 0.7 propensity score of voting for Mitt Romney, we can run 1,000 iterations of the election, determine how likely, and do weighted coin flips, basically. Of 1, did they turn out and vote in this sample election? And 2, did they vote for Mitt Romney? And you can look at those, basically, using simulation. You can tweak various assumptions. Well, let's say that we do increase, turnout among white women 35 plus by, 1 point. Or let's say their propensity actually gets shifted down at the same time. What are the outcomes of the simulations under those circumstances? But in terms of other avenues for analytics, one thing we did was we actually ran an experiment on candidate visit effects. We essentially looked at the upcoming schedule over the next few weeks for the governor and also Congressman Ryan, and we were able to randomly allocate to a certain degree. It wasn't a perfect experiment that would get written up in the American Political Science Review, but it was close enough. And we would basically say, okay, let's send them to this market, and let's do a joint visit here. And we were doing calls into those markets before and after, and we were measuring the effect of those visits on things like favorability, information flow, candidate characteristics like trust and understands people like me, and also on the ballot. And we were able to essentially model the effects of those visits, of a Romney visit alone, of a Ryan visit alone, of a joint visit together. Do those effects vary depending upon the size of the media market? We were also doing calls into adjacent media markets to measure spillover effects. And ultimately, at the end of the analysis, we were able to go back to the strategy team with a case of how much it moves key ballot or key characteristics and ballot, and help us inform the travel schedule in the last 3 weeks.
So you talked about $1 billion budget. You guys had a little less than that, but these are exceptional campaigns.
Yep.
I think everybody tends to underappreciate how different a presidential re-election is, especially than anything else that exists in politics. So broadly, if you're giving advice to people who are running down ballot campaigns or non-candidate campaigns, or working with party committees doing a lot of races, what are either specific tools that can be usefully adopted by campaigns with smaller budgets, with less time, with smaller staff, and what are general lessons from sort of thinking analytically about problem solving in campaigns that translate regardless of the sort of setting of the campaign? Do you want to?
Sure. It does get tricky because to do analytics well, usually the measurement of those effects takes a lot of money, right? Yeah. But it is doable. There are ways to basically insert.
And that's mostly through polling costs. At some point, you have to be right.
Yeah, I mean, basically, there are only so many ways that you can measure the effect of a touch, even though Dan doesn't like that word. There are only so many ways you can measure that, and the most common is to do calls before and then after, and those calls cost money. Of course, you could do robocalls, which are cheaper. But, you know, A/B testing has gotten to a point where it is very simple to do, very straightforward. You get a tool like Optimizely, which actually is an outgrowth of the work on the 08 campaign.
This is for websites and email,
for
but
websites,
for digital.
For digital, you know, just inserting that way of thinking, I think is somewhat straightforward. But I think one of the things that the left has done really well is they've created this culture of being data-driven and analytics, and they've trained up a class of operatives across, you know, from those that are just entering the consulting space to those that are very seasoned consultants in how to be data-driven and how to understand how to ask questions and how to gather and collect that data. And I think it's worked very effectively. But I think the key fundamental principle is you can test and measure just about anything that you're considering doing. And that right there has been very hard to get that point across. That if you're struggling between a decision of whether we do A or B, there is a way to empirically figure out which is better, which is more effective. And just really embracing that first, I think, is hugely important.
Is that something that people should? I mean, you talked about running an experiment with candidate visits.
Yeah.
I mean, how much, and obviously, you know, how much experimentation testing is, both from a methodological perspective and from a practical perspective, worth trying to take on in a small race with a limited time frame? And
yeah, I mean that's a problem. I think it is perceived as a luxury, and maybe in some instances should be perceived as a luxury because you only have a finite amount of money. I think it's a matter of doing what you can early on to measure the effectiveness of that, and working with it's more a function of having a culture on your side of the aisle where you can build this kind of bank of wisdom and bank of knowledge, and finding external organizations that can fund these experiments in the off years that can then be shared liberally across that ecosystem.
Yeah, I guess a few points. Number one would be get help.
Where should people look for help?
Well, on the left, as you say, we have a lot of resources for that. The Analyst Institute, the DNC, the committees, et cetera. So there are a considerable amount of resources to help provide people with infrastructure and different levels of support. But I guess as far as thinking about analytics, there's kind of three scales or three levels of data utilization. You have reporting, which is literally just observing what's going on, right? A spreadsheet of what's going on. Monitoring, which is observing what's going on through the lens of some metrics that you actually care about. And then statistical inference, which is looking at your data and making inferences about different people based on your data. And everybody should do one. You should try and do two. And if you can do three, that's great, and you should do it. But don't break your organization in trying to do it. Like micro-targeting and stuff like that. You should think about what a reasonable percent of your budget is that you should spend on this. It's reasonable to say that organizations should be spending 5% of their budget on figuring out if the rest of that 95% of the organization is actually doing anything. That's reasonable. Maybe it's 10%, But every organization should make a decision collectively that of the money we raise, some X percent of this money is going to go to some individuals who are going to decide if what we're doing is doing anything. That seems reasonable, right? And two is to focus on the bare bones stuff in priority of just observing what's going on, building metrics, not necessarily going crazy about modeling and all that stuff. And then three, I think, and part of the thing that gets lost in the conversation about data and analytics and targeting and all that is that the easiest thing to optimize is your own organizational growth, right? It's not, what voters we talk to. It's May of your election year, you're going to call somebody and ask them to do work for you, right? How do you make sure that you're calling the right person with the right message so they actually come into your office to come and do work for you and do it well, right? That is stuff where everything is observable. You can control everything. You can see whether or not you're succeeding or not. And the outputs are very clear, and the outputs are extremely beneficial. We know GeoTV works at least in off years, right? If you're doing you're targeting supporters with middling turnout scores, you're going to get some effect, hopefully. And so, one thing I would encourage small organizations is you're not just thinking about your mail, you're not just thinking about your field, you're not just thinking about TV, but you're thinking about how you're building your own organization, reporting metrics and inferences, and how to build that better.
So, like any good Obama campaign staffer, he started by telling a volunteer story and ended with a rousing call for volunteer recruitment done intelligently. I want to thank both these guys, Alex Landry and Dan Wagner, and I guess it's time that everybody can go drink. So thank you. That's 20 minutes? Oh, okay, so
Hi.
Should we take some questions?
Sure.
We have?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for that. So could you talk maybe a bit more about some of the experiments you did do and some of the outcomes, things that you learned? Not about the methodology, but about the tactics or the delivery or things that in these large-scale experiments that in either of your cases you were surprised by or you learned from.
I can speak real quickly to the candidate visit experiments we did. It was very interesting. One of the primary questions we had was, how much more lift did we get out of having a joint visit by the two candidates together, right? By Congressman Ryan and Governor Romney appearing jointly at a rally. And was that kind of scheduling difficulty worth it? Did it have an effect size larger than the effect of maybe even two back-to-back individual visits? And what we found was, at least during the time that we conducted the experiment, was that a joint visit was actually, in fact, had stronger power than two individual visits.
And that was power on the horse race and on?
We saw the most effect on characteristics. We did see small ballot effects. And everything essentially moved.
And characteristics were?
Characteristics are things like has a plan to fix the economy, things like that, cares about people like me. And so we did find that joint visits were actually more powerful than two individual ones. And we also were very curious about the decay of those effects. How many days did it take for it to wear off? What was the half-life of that effect? And in this particular instance, we found that after about 4 or 5 days, the effects were essentially gone. But still, those 4 or 5 days, it was meaningful.
And were you able to measure the effect on local media coverage or sentiment of local social media?
Unfortunately not. And on sentiment analysis, I think one of the big hurdles it has and one of the biggest rooms for improvement is they are not very good at geographic fencing. Right? They're not very good at that. It's basically, the internet doesn't discriminate.
Do you want to talk about some
Sure,
of the experiments?
I'll talk about two, one that was a disaster and then one that was adjusted properly with success, right? So the first one was 2009, it was the Deeds campaign. It was a great race for us. We really did well. We sent out a mailer. It was several 100,000 households, and we kept out a control group of people and we were going to survey the people who got the mail, statistically identical group of people who didn't get the mail, and see what happened. And the mail was frankly, pretty inflammatory choice stuff. We looked at the results, and the results were the following. The average treatment effect in terms of horse race was negative 1.7%. The average turnout effect, statistically significant, was 0.7%. Positive. See where I'm going? decrease in support, increase in turnout, which is about the worst result, and yeah, in fact is the worst possible result. And we dug into and we found like by subgroups and all that, and we asked people what happened in the survey, and people just hated it. It just completely turned them off to the process. Even though in focus groups, people said, oh yeah, super fired up about that. Or polling, people said, oh yeah, that's really gonna make people mad. The problem is like those focus groups and the polling don't take into account all the other people who are gonna see this mail in your household and get super pissed off about it and think your candidate's a total jerk.
So the experiment wasn't a failure.
So
You just realized that your messaging was
yeah.
poorly suited to the environment.
Right, exactly. And if in hindsight, if we had done the test right, we would have said, oh boy, no, not going to do that. In 2012, we did a similarly sized test, but more kind of elegant, pure design, one controller group, 3 different messages, and it was a Medicare piece. And we got the results back with a, average treatment effect of, 0.2 or 0.3%. But what we discovered is the type of people that were responding to Medicare were between 45 and 60, not 65 plus. Yeah. So the people that were eligible but not yet receiving Medicare found the idea of losing Medicare as something very compelling and persuasive, where people who already had Medicare said, I'm not losing it, no big deal, whatever. And it allowed us to essentially focus, identify strategically a new group of people who hadn't emerged in the polling or the focus groups as being extremely concerned. But when we actually presented the evidence to them, we figured that we basically altered the entire plan of Medicare about how we're talking to voters. It's not just about people who are losing their current coverage, it's about people who believe that they earned a set of coverage and that they were going to lose the right to receive that coverage in several years, even though they had, paid into their guaranteed benefits plan.
Yeah, and so to make clear, and because you're integrating an experimental design with a voter file that
Yep.
has hundreds of pieces of data for each voter appended to it,
Yep.
you are not limited by the factuals that you ask in a poll to categorize voters, but you could have modeled the, what you call heterogeneous treatment effects by any characteristic that you had available on the voter file.
In this case,
and you just happened to
age.
see, it was age, right?
In this case, yeah, it was just a very
But if people
simple,
moved according to geography, or if they moved according to
but in this
having
case,
a
it was
hunting
just,
license or something, it would have.
it's just a very pronounced age distribution. It was like, wow, there it is, and it very much kind of changed our perspective, not only about that specific mail piece, but how we were talking about Medicare in general and who was going to be most responsive to that particular message about it.
Take another question? Yeah.
Hi, thanks for this very interesting panel. Ben Tulchin from Tulchin Research. I'm a pollster, and I've done a fair amount of modeling and micro-targeting in my career. And one two-part question. One is, people hold out data as holier than thou. It's sacred. It's sacrosanct. But the reality is, it's garbage in, garbage out. If you have a crappy list, crappy voter file, your data is only going to be so good. So one is, what do you do about that, and how do you improve upon that? And two is, models are only so good until they don't work anymore. And one example I'd love to hear from both of you is what happened after the first presidential debate when the race fundamentally changed. So I'm sure both your models, all of a sudden people were supporting Obama or not supporting Romney. Boom, the race changed by 8 points, and all of a sudden you had a whole new model, whole new ball game. So I'd love to hear from both those points if I could.
Alex, you wanna?
Well, yeah, you're right. All models are wrong right away. All data is bad the second I hand it over to you. It's probably even bad before I handed it over to you because somebody died, somebody changed their name, somebody moved, right? And all models are ultimately wrong. We're dealing with probabilities here. There's always a Texan living in Chinatown, right? And so it is a matter of being sure that the data you're getting is good. And it's first of that, starting with a great canonical voter file and working from there. But then it is a matter of setting priorities as an organization of what levels of access do you give your operatives and your volunteers to basically update that voter file with better information. That's really a decision you need to make as an organization, is how much trust you give to those people to make those updates, to say this is wrong, right? Now in terms of updating models, in an ideal circumstance, what you have is you have dynamic modeling. As new data comes in, you update your models accordingly. And that is done. The question is, how frequently is it done, and how do you get that data? Those are the things you need to consider. But those are all, problems that we have to deal with every single day on the campaign.
How often were your models reflecting changes in the race?
Very often. I mean, we're very fortunate that we have two long-standing, credible organizations in the democratic progressive world, the DNC and Catalyst, who have both invested millions of dollars into this in building very, very, very elegant data, right? So, we're very kind of fortunate that we have a level of certainty about what we put into the models is very good because of the work that's gone into those in the last decade. In terms of the example about the first debate is very interesting. By the end of the campaign, we were polling, the analytics team itself was polling between 8,000 and 11,000 people per night. So we essentially ran it out, which is kind of a lot.
These are short calls. These are seven questions.
7 to 10 question calls, and we were doing 8,000 to 11,000 per night.
And they were live interviews.
Live interviews.
So basically expanded ID calls.
Yeah,
right?
expanded ID calls. So it's significant expense, but it's fine. And we had that going, and I think that before and after the first debate is more like 20,000 a night or something like that. But one thing that came out of the debates is Gallup publishes this thing that says Obama loses 6 points or something like that. And after the first debate, Jim Messina came into my office and he kind of grabs me and he's like, buddy, you got to figure this out, right? And I'm like, okay, all right. So we basically had kind of 48 hours to come back with them with an answer on what was going on, right? And polling depends on a few things. It's number one, are you completely you're calling the right people, right? So do you have the right turnout screen? Are you calling the right sample? So, for example, do you include cell phones? Do you include bilingual calls? Because if you don't, your poll is wrong, and you should be obliterated, right? Number three is, are you factoring in differences in response rates for different subdemographics? If you're wrong on any of those three things, your poll is going to be wrong. Gallup happened to be wrong on all of those three things this cycle, right? And a lot of these public polling firms happen to be wrong on all three of those things. So after the first debate, Gallup publishes the report that we say we're down 7 points. We look in the data, taking into account the differences in the sampling, the changes in response rates, and we see a drop of about 1.4%. About 1.4%. Right?
On their numbers?
No. And the internal,
on
on our end,
yeah.
we see, maybe a little bit more than 1% statistically significant change after the first debate. So there was this public perception of it's apocalypse. We look at our data, which is 10,000 or 20,000 IDs per night, and it says there's a drop of, maybe 1%. And the reason we were able to make that estimate is because we had these models that took into account all those different sampling features and all those response rate problems that we were getting because of 1 or 2 days of calling, such that we could average out all those problems and get a better, more accurate view of the electorate that essentially said, this is a problem, but not really a problem, so don't change and kind of move forward. And that's part of it.
Did you model the attributes of the percent that was moving? Who were they?
It was hardly anybody. Yeah, it was a lot of the people that we had previously won in the past few weeks of kind of marginal independents and stuff like that. But keep in mind, it's 1 out of every 100 voters changed their minds, right? So if you looked around a room and you saw 100 people, one of those people said, I'm changing my mind distinctly right now, which isn't a lot of people,
Yeah.
Yeah, hi, I'm Vivian from Infinity Media, and you mentioned that you used text mining programs, but you mentioned that you only used it for English sites, so I'm not sure if you did it for other languages, because I'm sure there were other conversations going on in other languages.
Yeah, that's a blind spot of sentiment analysis, because a lot of this stuff, they use natural language processing algorithms, so basically a lot of linguists sit down in a room and create rules of English syntax and grammar, and that's what's used to know that when they say, you know, Mitt Romney is a great man, they know that they can attribute the great to Mitt Romney, and they know that Mitt Romney is a person. So I think that there are people developing, especially Spanish language text mining capabilities, but there aren't really any robust tools out there that
These are not specifically political tools. These are tools that were designed for other purposes.
Yeah, these tools can be used for anything. But yeah, it's actually one interesting point, a story I'll tell about that is our worst day of the campaign, according to our sentiment analysis tool. That is the day that had the highest volume and was the most negative, was actually the Sunday of Mitt Romney's foreign trip. It was not 47%. That was our second worst day. But it was the Sunday of Mitt Romney's foreign trip, and I think, my speculation is that the reason that that had such high volume was because it is also accounting for English language foreign press.
Right.
And so I think it got all that international coverage. And so just an interesting aside in that regard.
Question? We have one up.
Could you speak about the role of IP matching in determining location as the technology progresses, how effective it is, and where you see that going? And also, I'd be interested in your experience with direct mail as a driver to the internet as a way of also capturing and coding.
Not really.
I mean, all I can really say is that location on the internet is tricky. Yep. It's tough, and that's been most pronounced in our attempts to do sentiment analysis by DMAs, especially what we're interested in. It's just very difficult. But otherwise, I don't have much experience with IP matching. In terms of direct mail driving to the internet, I mean, we haven't done any specific tests there. It does not seem to be all that powerful, the indication I've been given.
Yeah, we tried.
But
With QR codes? Is that, yeah.
But we haven't tested it as robustly as we should.
And you just see that people weren't using it as
horribly expensive. Yeah.
It's much cheaper to just do online advertising to drive them.
Anything else out there?
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much. Thanks once again, Dan Wagner, Alex Lundberg.
Thank you.
You guys can hang out. We're going to photograph of you as the panel, if the photographer come back up. While we're waiting for that, Liz, would you come up? Liz Chatterton's on our board of directors, and I'm going to have her make the announcement about the Women's Networking event one more time. While she's headed to the stage, you have a fan club here, Liz. That's great. We want to remind you about our online auction for the foundation. Go to the AAPC.org website and bid it up. You see what you can get. Come on up, Liz.
Bid it up.
Bid it up.
Bid it up. So for the exact reason that the vast majority of this room is currently male, M-A-L-E, and apparently that won't drive you to the internet. Oh, come on, that was funny. We are having actually our first ever AAPC women's event at 6 o'clock here in the hotel in Capitol Room A. It's the Women of Power Hour. Men, you are not invited. I'm not kidding. We actually have a current bet going on how many of you are going to try to come. But ladies, we would love to have you. It is open bar. The cocktail of the hour will be vodka, mostly martinis, but if you want it straight, it's up to you. And hors d'oeuvres, because we raised more money for this event through the women consultant community than for any single event at AAPC this year. So thank you to all the women consultants who are sponsoring this event, and we would love to have you come. I'm going to be doing GOTV in the bar in a minute, trying to get all the women there. Gentlemen, we'll see you at 7 o'clock.
And we'll be back here tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., right? See you then.